SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Yoga Karmasu Kaushalam.
Hello students, today we will be discussing about theory of supply-2. Let us start with the objectives of this session. First we will learn about supply schedule and supply curve. Then we understand the types of supply. Further we discuss the difference between movement versus shift in the supply curve. And then we talk about market supply versus individual supply. Let us start with the first topic of this session, that is supply schedule and supply curve. Let us start with a brief understanding of what do we mean by a supply schedule. So a supply schedule is a table showing the relationship between price and quantity supplied, holding other factors constant. It provides a systematic way to analyze how supply responds to price changes across a range of possible prices. Supply schedules help producers plan production levels and help analysts understand market supply behavior. They make abstract supply relationships concrete and quantifiable for practical business and policy analysis. The supply schedule format allows easy comparison of supply responses at different price levels and helps to identify patterns in producer behavior that might not be obvious from individual price quantity observations. So let us try and understand individual producer supply schedule. An individual supply schedule shows how much one producer is willing to supply at various price levels. This reflects that producer's specific cost structure, production capacity and business strategy. Different producers typically have different supply schedules based on their efficiency levels, technology size and the market position. More efficient producers can profitably supply goods at lower prices than less efficient competitors. Understanding individual supply schedules helps explain industry dynamics and competitive positioning. It also helps predict how industry supply might change as more efficient producers gain market share. Now let us look at the supply curve characteristics. The supply curve is a graphical representation of the supply schedule, typically showing an upward sloping graph from left to the right. This positive slope reflects the law of supply, that is, higher prices generally encourage higher quantities supplied. The steepness of the supply curve indicates supply elasticity, which we will discuss in a later session. Steep curve represents inelastic supply that does not respond much to price changes, while flat curves represent elastic supply that responds strongly to price variations. The position of supply curve indicates overall supply levels. Curves positioned higher and to the left represent lower supply, while curves positioned lower and to the right represent higher supply. Now let us talk about market supply curve. The market supply curve aggregates all individual producers' supply curves in the market and gives us a common figure. It shows total quantity supplied by all producers at each level, representing the industry's overall supply response. Market supply curves are typically flatter than individual supply curves because they include the entry and exit of producers in response to price changes. As price rise, not only do existing producers increase output, but new producers may enter the market. The market supply curve provides the foundation for analyzing industry behavior, market equilibrium and effects of various economic policies on overall market outcomes. Let us now quickly talk about short run versus long run supply curves. Short run supply curves reflect production decisions when some factors of production are fixed. Producers can adjust variable inputs like labor and material but cannot change factory size or major equipment. Long run supply curves allow for adjustment of all production factors. Producers can build new facilities, adopt new technologies and completely reconfigure production systems in response to price signal. So basically short run is when at least one factor of production cannot be changed, and long run is when all the factors of production can be changed. Long run supply curves are typically more elastic than short run supply curves because producers have more flexibility, that is all the factors are variables to respond to price changes when they can adjust all aspects of their operations. Now let us move to the second topic, that is types of supply. First is based on time period. Market period supply covers when time is so short that supply is essentially fixed. Agricultural products immediately after harvest have market supply period, that is the quantity available cannot be increased regardless of price because the production cycle is now complete. Short run supply allows for some adjustment of variable inputs but holds fixed inputs constant. Manufacturers can work existing facilities more intensively, hire temporary workers or purchase more raw materials but cannot expand physical capacity. Long run supply on the other hand permits adjustment of all inputs including physical capacity. Producers can build new factories, install new equipments, develop new technologies and completely redesign their production systems. Very long run supply curves considers fundamental changes in technology, infrastructure, industry structure and economic organization. Over very long periods, entirely new industries can emerge while others disappear. Then the second aspect is based on nature of goods. Durable goods supply involves products that last for extended periods. Producers of durable goods must consider replacement cycles, customer upgrade patterns and the existing stock of goods in use while making supply decisions. Non-durable goods supply involves products consumed quickly, replaced frequently. These goods typically have more predictable demand patterns and faster inventory turnover, affecting supply planning. Service supply involves intangible outputs that cannot be stored. Service supply must match demand in real time because services cannot be produced in advance and held as an inventory. Perishable goods supply involves products with limited shelf life. Suppliers of perishable goods face unique challenges in matching production timing with market demand to minimize waste. Then the third is based on market structure. Perfectly competitive supply occurs when many small producers sell identical products. Individual producers are price takers who adjust quantity supplied in response to market prices that they cannot control. Monopolistic supply on the other hand involves a single producer who has some control over price. Monopolistic supplier considers how their output decisions affect market prices when making supply choices. Oligopolistic supply involves a few large producers whose decisions affect each other. Supply decisions in oligopolistic market often involve strategic considerations about competitor responses. Monopolistically competitive supply involves many producers selling differentiated products. Each producer has some pricing power for their specific product variant while facing competition from similar products. Now let us discuss a very important topic, that is movement versus shift in the supply curve. Let us understand the distinction between the two. The distinction between movement along a supply curve and shift in supply curve is fundamental to supply analysis. Movement along the supply curve occurs when only price changes, while shifts occur when other factors affecting supply change. This distinction helps separate the effects of price changes from the effects of other supply determinants. It clarifies whether observed supply change results from a market price movement or from underlying changes in supply conditions. Understanding the difference is crucial for business planning and policy because it helps identify the true causes of supply changes and predict how markets will respond to various interventions. Let us look at the movement along the supply curve. Expansion of supply occurs when quantity supplied increases due to rise in price while all other factors remain constant. This represents movement up and to the right along the supply curve, existing supply curve. Contraction of supply occurs when quantity supplied decreases due to fall in price, representing movement down and to the left along the existing supply curve. These movements reflect the normal operation of the law of supply as producers respond to price signals while underlying assumption conditions remain the same or unchanged. Now let us look at the shift in supply curve against movement. Increase in supply involves a rightward shift parallelly of the entire supply curve, meaning producers are willing to supply more at every price level or at the same price level. This occurs when underlying supply conditions improve and price does not change. Decrease in supply involves a leftward shift of the entire supply curve parallelly, meaning producers are willing to supply less at every price level or at a given price level. This occurs when underlying supply conditions deteriorates. So basically, changes in price lead to movement along the supply curve, that is also called expansion and contraction, whereas changes in all the other factors leads to shift in supply curve, which is called increase and decrease. These shifts reflect changes in fundamental supply determinants such as technology, input costs or regulatory conditions. Now what are the causes of supply curve shifts? Technological improvements typically shift supply curves rightwards by reducing production costs or increasing efficiency. New production methods, better equipment or improved processes enable greater supply at all the price levels. Input cost changes shift supply curves based on whether costs increase or decrease. Lower input costs shifts the supply curve rightward, that is more will be able to produce, while higher input costs shift the supply curve leftwards, that is lesser will be produced. Government policy changes can shift supply through taxes, subsidies, regulations or other interventions. Favorable policies increase supply while unfavorable policies decrease the supply. Producer expectations about future conditions can shift the entire supply or the current supply curve. Expectations of future price increases might reduce current supply as producers hold or store goods for future sales. Let us look at some practical examples. Consider the smartphone industry. When manufacturers develop more efficient production process, the supply curve shifts rightwards, enabling more phones to be produced at any given price level. In agriculture, favorable weather conditions shift supply curve rightwards for affected crops, while droughts or natural disasters shift supply curves to the left. The introduction of ride-sharing apps shifted the supply curve for transportation services rightwards by enabling more people to provide transportation services using their personal vehicles. Now let us talk about the last topic, that is market supply and individual supply. So first we have the idea of aggregating individual supplies. Market supply is derived by adding the quantities that all individual producers are willing to supply at each price. The horizontal summation process creates the total market supply curve from individual producers' decisions. The aggregation process reveals how individual business decisions combine to create market level outcomes. It shows how entry and exit of individual firms affects the overall market supply. Understanding this aggregation helps explain why market supply curves often have different shapes than individual supply curves and why responses to price changes can be larger than individual producer responses. Then the second aspect is heterogeneity among producers. Different producers typically have different cost structures, efficiency levels and production capacities. The heterogeneity means individual supply curves vary significantly across producers in the same industry. Low-cost producers can profitably supply goods at lower prices than high-cost producers. As market prices rise, high-cost producers who were previously unprofitable can enter the market, increasing the total supply. This producer heterogeneity explains the shape of market supply curves and why supply responses often involve both existing producers increasing output and new producers entering the market. Then we look at industry supply dynamics. Industry supply reflects a collective decision of firms in the industry, including decisions about entry, exit, capacity, expansion, and production levels. These decisions are influenced by industry structure, competitive conditions, and regulatory environment. Industries with low barriers to entry typically have more elastic supply because new firms can easily enter when prices rise. Industries with high barriers to entry usually have less elastic supply curve because capacity expansion is very difficult. The competitive dynamics within industries also affect supply behavior. Industries with intense competition might have different supply responses than those with more cooperative relationships among firms. Then we also have the impact of geographic conditions. Supply often varies across geographic regions due to differences in input costs, transportation, expenses, regulatory conditions, and local market factors. Regional supply difference helps explain price variation across different locations. Transportation costs create geographic boundaries for supply, with producers typically supplying a nearby market before serving distant ones. These geographic patterns affect both individual firm supply decisions and overall market supply. International trade extends these geographic considerations globally, with comparative advantages determining which countries supply different goods to the world markets. Then we also have temporal aspects of supply. Supply conditions change over time as technology evolves, costs change, and market structures develop. Understanding these temporal patterns helps predict future supply trends and market evaluation. Cyclical factors can create regular patterns in supply, such as seasonal variation in agricultural production or business cycle effects on manufacturing output. Long-term trends in supply reflect fundamental changes in production technology, resource availability, and economic development. These trends shape industry evolution and competitive dynamics over extended periods. Now, if we summarize the session, then the theory of supply provides essential insights into producer behavior and market dynamics. Supply represents producers' willingness and ability to offer goods for sale at various prices. The law of supply establishes the positive relationship between price and quantity supplied that drives market behavior. Multiple factors beyond price affect supply, including production costs, technology, input availability, government policies, and expectations as well. Understanding these factors help predict supply changes, and so on. The distinction between individual and market supply and between movement and shift along the supply curves provides a tool for analyzing market dynamics and predicting responses to challenging conditions. Supply theory guides production planning, capacity decisions, pricing strategies, and market entry timing. It particularly helps business and business students to understand the dynamics of competitive positioning. Different time periods allow different types of supply adjustments. From short-run output changes to long-run capacity expansion, this temporal framework helps plan business strategies. Supply analysis helps evaluate the effects of government policies, regulations, and market interventions on production and market outcomes. The theory of supply combined with theory of demand provides the foundation for understanding how markets coordinate production and consumption decisions, determine prices, and allocate resources efficiently across the economy. So, if we conclude the session, then the theory of supply is central to understanding how producers respond to market conditions by their collective actions. We learn supply schedules, supply curves, and the factors that cause movements and shifts, where we gain valuable insights into responsiveness of producers to price and non-price determinants as well. Recognizing the differences between individual and market supply as well as the role of time horizons helps in predicting production patterns, competitive behavior, and capacity adjustment. This knowledge is essential for business students in planning production, setting prices, and strategizing market entry, while also enabling policymakers to anticipate the impact of regulations, subsidies, and other interventions on overall market performance. Ultimately, supply theory, when paired with demand analysis, forms a cornerstone of economic reasoning, explaining how markets balance production and consumption to allocate resources efficiently over time and across regions. I hope you understood and enjoyed the session. Thank you so much.